Have you ever stopped to think about the fact that there was a time when humans were completely silent? Imagine you are sitting around a flickering campfire about 100,000 years ago. You are shivering from the cold, your stomach is growling with hunger, and you can sense something massive and hairy moving just beyond the shadows. You want to warn your friend sitting across from you, so you do exactly what any person today would do. You open your mouth to speak, but absolutely nothing happens. No sound comes out because of a strange fact that people rarely discuss. There was a genuine, scientifically proven era when human beings simply could not talk. We didn't have words, we didn't have names, and we didn't even have meaningful grunts. It was just total biological silence. How we moved from being a creature staring blankly at a mammoth to a species that created podcasts, political arguments, and the classic lie, "I'm fine when we are clearly not okay," is one of the biggest mysteries in science. We are diving into that mystery today. So if you are enjoying this journey into our past so far, go ahead and smash that like button. Now let's look at the biggest hurdle here. Unlike old bones, stone tools, or even colorful cave paintings, human language leaves behind zero physical tracks. You can't go into the dirt, dig up a fossil, and find a preserved sentence. You can't use carbon dating on an ancient conversation. Language is literally made of moving air, and air doesn't last through geological time. Because of this, the scientists who study where speech came from are like forensic experts. They have to piece together a massive puzzle using whatever tiny fragments they can find, like the shape of ancient skulls, the tiny hyoid bones in the throat, specific genetic changes, and old art on cave walls. It involves a lot of very smart guessing, and those guesses are actually pretty wild. But here's the crazy part that we have to figure out first. What even is language? Before humans developed what we call real language, we almost certainly used something simpler. We know that animals communicate, and that isn't really up for debate. Bees perform a little waggle dance to show their hive where the best flowers are located. Dolphins use unique whistles that basically act like names for each other. Even wild chimpanzees have a complex system of calls and hand gestures to share basic info. So the real mystery isn't when living things started talking to each other. It's when that talk turned into actual language. When did we finally cross that invisible line where a signal becomes a symbol? There is a huge fundamental gap between those two things. A signal is very direct and usually means just one thing. When a dog growls, it's because it feels threatened. The growl itself is the threat. But a symbol is different because it's abstract. The word danger is just a specific pattern of sounds that we all agreed would represent the idea of being unsafe. The word doesn't sound scary on its own, and it doesn't look like a threat. We just decided as a group that those vibrations in the air would mean that one specific thing. If you think about it, that is totally insane. Every single word you have ever said is basically a social hallucination that billions of people just happen to share. Making that jump from a direct signal to an abstract symbol was the mental revolution that changed the world forever. Now, this is where it gets interesting because scientists cannot agree on when this shift happened. There are two main groups of thinkers who have been arguing about this for many decades. The first group believes language grew slowly over hundreds of thousands of years. They think simple calls slowly got more complex until they turned into full grammar. This is called the continuity hypothesis. These experts look at our cousins like chimps and gorillas, who already show the beginnings of symbolic thought. These animals can learn sign language and even combine symbols in new ways to communicate. They seem to understand that objects have specific names. If they can do it, maybe language is just the final stop on a very long road that started millions of years ago. However, the second group of scientists believes something completely different. They believe there was a single massive moment, a giant leap that happened between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, where something inside the human brain just clicked. Maybe it was a tiny mutation, or our brains finally hit a certain level of complexity, but suddenly, we unlocked the power of complex grammar. This gave us the ability to stack ideas inside of other ideas, like saying, "The man who I think knows the woman who lost her dog." Think about that for a second. That is a sentence inside another sentence. This theory suggests that before that specific moment, nothing like it existed. It's called the discontinuity hypothesis. And if it's true, language didn't slowly grow like a tree. It exploded like a volcano. If you're finding this as wild as I am, go ahead and hit that like button so more people can see this. Now, the truth is likely somewhere in the middle, with different parts of the puzzle coming together at different times. But here is where it gets really interesting. Let's look at the body first. Language isn't just something that happens in your mind. It is a physical act. To make the wide range of sounds we use every day, you need a very specific set of tools inside your throat. For almost all of evolutionary history, our ancestors simply didn't have them. The most important part is the larynx, or your voice box, and specifically where it sits in your neck. In most mammals, including our cousins the chimpanzees, the larynx is positioned very high up. This is actually a great survival feature because it lets them breathe and swallow at the same time without the risk of choking. It's practical and efficient, but it also means they can't make many different sounds. In humans, however, the larynx dropped much lower. This created a bigger space for air to vibrate, called the pharynx, which gives us the ability to make all the vowels and consonants we need for speech. But here's the crazy part. The trade-off for being able to talk is that we can choke. We are literally the only mammals on Earth that regularly die because a piece of food went down the wrong pipe. Every single year, thousands of people die from things like a piece of steak or a big sandwich. Evolution basically looked at the situation and decided that being able to talk was worth the risk of dying from a piece of bread. If you want to keep learning about these weird human quirks, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell so you never miss an update. The larynx probably moved down slowly over millions of years, and different ancient humans had it in different spots. But here is the frustrating thing for scientists. The larynx is made of soft tissue, and soft tissue doesn't turn into fossils. It just rots away. So we have to guess based on what is left behind, and that means looking at the bones. There is one tiny bone called the hyoid that gives us a massive clue. It's a small U-shaped bone in your throat that holds the muscles you use to speak and swallow. It's actually the only bone in your entire body that isn't connected to another bone. It just floats there, held up by muscles. Because it's so tied to the muscles we use for talking, its shape tells us a lot about how well an ancient human could speak. Back in 1989, researchers found a perfect hyoid bone at a Neanderthal site in Israel called Kibara Cave. It was 60,000 years old, and when they looked at it, they were shocked. It was almost exactly like a modern human's bone. This was a game changer because it meant Neanderthals might have had the physical equipment to talk just like us. But wait until you hear what the DNA experts found, because that's when the story really takes a turn. In 2002, scientists found a gene called FOXP2. The media went crazy and called it the language gene, which made scientists everywhere roll their eyes because it's way more complicated than that. But the reason it got that name is actually pretty incredible. When someone has a broken version of this FOXP2 gene, things get really difficult. They can't quite get their mouth and tongue to move correctly to form words, and they struggle with the basic rules of grammar. It's a tough condition that affects every part of their life, But here is the part that really blew everyone's minds. It turns out that the human version of this gene is totally unique compared to every other animal on the planet, even our closest relatives like chimpanzees. If you're finding this as fascinating as I am, go ahead and hit that like button right now. You see, mice have this gene. Songbirds have it too. Even crocodiles have their own version of it. But the human version has two very specific changes that don't show up anywhere else in nature. Evolution seemed to be in a massive hurry to make sure we had these specific mutations. Then, things got even weirder when scientists started looking at Neanderthal DNA. They pulled genetic material from ancient bones. And guess what? The Neanderthals had those exact same human mutations. This suggests that both us and the Neanderthals shared the same biological tools for talking. Since our two groups split off from a common ancestor about 400,000 years ago, that ancestor must have had the gene too. The only other option is that we both evolved it separately by total accident. But most experts think that's way too unlikely. Now, this is where it gets interesting. By 400,000 years ago, our ancestors likely had the genetic blueprints for speech. By 60,000 years ago, Neanderthals definitely had the physical throat structure to make complex sounds. And somewhere along the way, the human brain rewired itself to handle deep, symbolic meaning. But none of this actually explains what those very first words sounded like. This is where the story gets pretty funny, because some of the theories out there are honestly hilarious. Make sure you hit subscribe and tap that bell so you don't miss the rest of this journey. The oldest idea is known as the bow wow theory. It's pretty straightforward. The first words were just people mimicking the world around them. If you saw a dog, you'd make a barking sound to describe it. If you heard a loud crack of thunder, you'd name it after that noise. We call this onomatopoeia, and we still use it today with words like hiss or buzz. But here's the problem. You can't really bark your way into explaining complicated ideas like justice or math. Eventually, you need real words that aren't just sound effects. But wait until you hear about the poo-poo theory. Yes, that is actually what scientists call it. This theory says language started from the sounds we make when we're emotional, like yelling ouch when you get hurt or laughing when something is funny. While we all make those sounds, they are mostly just reflexes, so it's hard to see how they turned into a structured language. Then you have the yo-he-ho theory. This one suggests that rhythmic grunts from working together, like pulling a heavy rope or lifting a big log, created the beat for our first words. It's like ancient sea shanties helping us learn to talk. There might actually be something to this, because music and language are very closely linked in our brains. Some people even think we were singing before we were ever talking. And finally, there is the ta-ta theory, which is just as charming as it sounds. This theory claims that talking actually started as a way for our voices to copy our hand movements. Early humans were likely waving their hands around, and their mouths just started following along, eventually turning physical signs into vocal sounds. Most scientists have moved on from this specific idea, but it's still a funny reminder that experts once named serious theories after random, silly sounds. However, the bigger idea that language grew out of body language is something people take very seriously today. But wait until you hear why the brain proves this. If you're enjoying this dive into our past, smash that like button right now. When we look at the human brain, the spot that handles language, called Broca's area, is sitting right next to the parts that control how we move our hands. In monkeys and apes, this same exact area is used for hand gestures and making faces. That isn't just a lucky coincidence. It shows a deep connection between moving and speaking. Think about pointing. It's the most basic way to communicate, basically saying, "Look at that thing over there." Interestingly, pointing with a finger is something only humans and maybe some apes in zoos really do. Wild chimps almost never point at things. Even human babies learn how to point long before they ever say their first word. There is a very strong case to be made that our hands started the conversation and our voices just joined in later. Now this is where it gets really interesting because we have to talk about the social brain. You can have the perfect throat, the right genes, and a brain wired for speech, but none of that matters without the right mental tools. You need something called theory of mind. This is the ability to realize that other people have their own thoughts, feelings, and goals that are different from yours. Real language, not just making noise, depends on this completely. Before we keep going, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next part of this story. When I speak to you, I'm not just making a sound. I'm making that sound because I want you to understand that I have something specific to tell you. It's almost like a form of social telepathy. I'm trusting that you can basically read my mind, and you're trusting that I'm trying to be clear. Most animals don't really seem to do this. When a chimp makes a sound, they are usually just asking for food or reacting to something scary. They aren't trying to share a story just for the sake of sharing it. This kind of teamwork, telling someone what happened yesterday or dreaming about the future, requires a level of social thinking that is totally unique to humans. But here's the crazy part. This social thinking grew right alongside the size of our tribes. About 500,000 years ago, our ancestors lived in tiny groups. But by 100,000 years ago, those groups were getting much bigger and more complicated. Dealing with more people means you have to keep track of who is friends with who and who you can actually trust. Some experts, like Robin Dunbar, think language evolved specifically to solve this problem. He famously called it social grooming. In the past, we cleaned each other's fur to bond, but as groups grew too big for that, we started using words to stay connected instead. Chimps keep their friendships alive by picking bugs off each other, which is nice, but it really doesn't work when your group grows to 150 people. Language changed the game because it lets you bond with many people at the same time. You could say gossip was the original killer app that forced our speech to evolve. Once we started talking, the feedback loop was incredible. Language allowed for better teamwork, which led to bigger and more complex tribes. If you're finding this evolution of us fascinating, hit that like button right now to help others find this story. As these societies grew, there was way more info to share, which pushed our language to become more detailed and much stronger. This precision meant we could pass down knowledge through generations. It wasn't just showing a kid how to sharpen a rock anymore. It was verbal teaching, explanations, and stories that kept that knowledge alive forever. But here's the crazy part. Once info could pile up over time instead of being rediscovered every single generation, cultural growth exploded. It moved at a speed that biology just couldn't keep up with. The very second language clicked into place, everything changed for good. Suddenly, humans were able to work with total strangers and plan things months into the future. We could even lie, which is actually a massive boost in brain power when you think about it. We started creating myths, gods, and social rules that glued huge groups of unrelated people together into one working society. Make sure to hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into human history. Everything we see today, farming, giant cities, books, science, and even this video, goes back to that one moment when a human looked at another and said something they both understood. We don't know when it happened or where exactly, though almost everyone agrees it was in Africa. We will likely never know what that very first word was. However, we are pretty sure that by 70,000 years ago, language was fully working. That's when humans started doing wild new things like making art and trading across huge distances. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Archaeologists call this the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, but it's really just the evidence of language. Look at the cave paintings in Chauvet from 36,000 years ago. They show animals with movement and depth. These were made by people who had stories to tell. We find Venus statues all over Europe, flutes made from bird bones, and jewelry made of shells and red clay. All of this comes from a species that learned to take an idea in their head and make it real in the physical world. That is the true power of language. It takes your inner thoughts and makes them public. It makes the invisible visible and turns one person's idea into a group's reality. But wait until you hear this next part. Every single one of the 7,000 languages on Earth today, from Mandarin to the click languages of the desert, shares a deep, hidden structure. Experts like Noam Chomsky call this universal grammar. The idea is that every language is actually the same thing, just wearing different clothes, because they all grow from the exact same hardware inside the human brain. Think about this. Babies everywhere on the planet learn to talk in the exact same way at the exact same speed. Whether a child is growing up in Tokyo, Lagos, or Sao Paulo, they all follow the same steps. They start by babbling, move to single words, then two-word phrases, and finally full sentences on a nearly identical timeline. Nobody actually sits them down to teach them the complex rules of grammar. The ability is already inside them. If you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, go ahead and hit that like button. But here's the crazy part. This world-changing power was built by evolution through millions of years of random accidents. It took a throat that changed shape, a specific gene mutation, and a brain that rewired itself for social life. Our ancestors needed to remember who owed what to whom while sitting around ancient campfires. Now this is where it gets really interesting. All those changes happened so that one night in Africa, two people could look at each other in the pitch black, and one could whisper, "Watch out, something is moving out there," and the other would actually understand. That is the true birth of language. It didn't start with beautiful poetry or love songs. It started with two minds finally touching across the darkness to share something that mattered. Which part of this journey surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments below. Every time you speak today, you're still using that same ancient magic.